speaking of preferential rents, we had a question from someone who asked if owners now have to renew a tenant's preferential rent rider using Rent Guidelines Board's renewal guidelines over the last prior preferential rent, how does this affect how renewal leases are offered?
Okay. This question has come up a lot. I've heard it several times over the last 2 weeks. I was actually a little surprised about how much questions there were about this. Preferential rents have been around for a while. You have, under rent stabilization, you have a legal regulated rent that is increased whenever you have a vacancy or when you had a vacancy or a renewal increase. In a lot of instances, if the market didn't bear the legal rent, owners would charge tenants a preferential rent. And generally this was done through a lease rider, so that the lease always said, this is the legal rent, this is the preferential rent. And the law was back and forth about this, but for a while now, you could have a preferential rent rider that said, your legal rent is $1,500. Under this lease renewal term, I'm going to charge you $1,200, but it's only for this term. The next time your lease is renewed, we can jump back to using the $1,500 as the base rent. Now, under the amended law, you can't do that. If you give the tenant a preferential rent, you have to renew the tenant's lease under the guidelines, but above the preferential rent. What I think is confusing people is that I'm not sure if owners are aware that you should still keep track of both. And this has been an issue for owners in the past. If there was no real record that you had both a higher rent and a preferential rent, you could lose the right to collect the higher rent. But both in the renewal leases as they're set up now and as they may be modified, I don't know, and under rent registration, you put down both the legal rent and the preferential rent. So owners should continue to do that so that at the point where a tenant moves out who had the preferential rent, it will be clear what the legal rent was and that you can resume charging the next tenant the legal rent rather than a preferential rent.
So what happens if a rent-stabilized tenant dies or moves out and there's a family member successor tenant? What happens in a preferential rent situation?
That may be a question right now. Well, as the law has stood for a while, a successor tenant is a family member who's entitled to remain in the apartment and become a tenant when the rent-stabilized tenant either dies or moves out. That individual is entitled to a renewal lease. So if that successor tenant is entitled to a renewal lease, it seems that they would also be entitled to the preferential rent. Now, that may not be 100% clear, and that may be an issue that may be subject to some difference of opinion and may come up in DHCR complaints or in case law. But it'll probably take a while for that to happen.